You're listening to Chicago Stories, a podcast from City Hall featuring the stories of everyday Chicagoans, as told to Mayor Emanuel.
This is Mayor Emanuel with Chicago Stories. Today's guest is Jonathan Eig. Did I get that right?
Yes, thanks.
Well, with Emanuel, you're sensitive.
Yeah, people get it wrong about half the time.
He's the author of the best-selling biography of Muhammad Ali, and also one on Al Capone.
Yep.
Jackie Robinson, The Pill.
Yeah.
Who else did I miss?
That's a New Yorker, so you're probably not familiar with him. His name's
Lou
Gehrig.
Yeah, and you have an upcoming one.
I'm working on a book about Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah, well, I want to ask you, how do you pick the people you want to write about?
Yeah, it's complicated. For every book, there's a different story. Mm-hmm. And for Ali, it really just came in a conversation with another writer. She was thinking about doing a book on Babe Ruth.
She was thinking of doing it.
Yeah, Jane Levy, great writer. And she called me for advice because I wrote about Gehrig and because we're pals. And I said she should do Babe Ruth because other than Muhammad Ali, there's no more interesting figure in the history of American sports. And when I hung up the phone with her, I realized Ali's an even better idea. And I was shocked to realize that there hadn't been an Ali biography, not a full one. There have been 100 books written about it. But nobody had done a real biography yet. So that just fell in my lap, really. And that's, with every book there's a different story, but often it's just the realization that this is an important story that needs to be told, and maybe there's something new to say about it. And hopefully it's something I'm passionate about, because you don't want to spend 3 or 4 years working on something and come to hate it halfway through.
How is it possible that probably not only the most, one, if not the most famous sports figure in America, and probably one of the most world-renowned sports figures, and nobody had written a complete biography?
That's true. And how? I think for a couple of reasons. One, it needed to sit for a while. You need some time to go by to understand why something's important, to put it in historical perspective. Ali made his name in the 60s and really made his most lasting impression, his most lasting mark in the 60s. So 50 years had gone by, you can start to put that in perspective. And then also sports writers had been covering him, and they're not so good at stepping back and doing the long view. So I got lucky that nobody had really tried it yet. I talked to one guy who had started on it and gave up. And I just got lucky that nobody had done the big book yet.
What's your 3 takeaways that you discovered in the research and the writing that you would say, I'm like, who knew when it comes to Ali?
He was punched 200,000 times.
200,000?
200,000 times, yep. And began to show signs of brain damage around 1970, 71. He fought for 10 more years after the brain damage had begun.
And the first signs or manifestation are?
Slow speech, murmuring, difficulty being understood, difficulty sleeping. And he talked about it because he was always talking. He loved talking to reporters, and he would ask them, do you think I'm mumbling? Do you think I'm slurring my speech? My wife says I'm slurring my speech. And they would say, yeah. Like everybody else, he didn't think it was really going to happen to him. So that was one of the big takeaways. Right. He was terrible to women, to his wives, and I spent a lot of time with his wives, talking to them and hearing about it in, really intimate detail. That was hard for me because I loved the guy.
I idolized him, yeah.
As a kid especially, but, don't write a book about your heroes.
Was he mean to them in person? I mean, in the relationship itself?
Yeah, he expected them to put up with the cheating. One of his wives he hit a couple of times, stuff that, there's just no way to explain or to...
Especially for such a peaceful person, or comes across.
Yeah, he was peaceful outside the ring, at least. He never got in fights outside the ring. He was always a really good-natured guy. And I guess another big takeaway for me was that he somehow, despite being the most famous man on earth, remained humble in a strange way. For a guy who called himself the greatest all the time, he never really... He
was a contradiction there?
Yeah, he never really got a big head. I think it was mostly an act when he went around saying that he was the greatest of all time, because he would sit around airports and take hours talking to strangers and never really thought he was better than anybody else in that way.
Do you think that I'm the greatest was the psychological warfare pre the match?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was. He once was asked, how much of this is a show and how much of it is real, and he said 70% show.
not 75,
no,
70.
70%. He had it down to a science. He really thought about that.
Okay, so that's the biggest takeaway on Ali. Al Capone. What's your, who knew? kind of 2 or 3 things about Al Capone.
I think you would have really liked like hanging out with Al Capone if you could just.
I would have.
Yeah, I think all of us, not just you.
Yeah.
I'm not. It's not a statement about you.
I was like, this is going to be the shortest interview we ever had. Although I actually admired that, so you could stay a little longer.
No, I'm not saying that you in particular have a lot in common
we don't
with
even
Al
know
Capone.
each other that well for you to insult me.
Right.
But thanks. Why is that? Just because he was a character?
Gregarious. He loved the city. He loved the music. He loved the sports. If you weren't in trouble with him, if you weren't doing business with him, you'd have a really good time. And that's part of the key to his success. Remember, he did this business, this illegal operation, dealing with criminals, dealing with politicians, dealing with cops.
Sometimes criminals and politicians were the same people.
I'm not saying that.
I can say that. Yeah.
And he kept it going for a better part of a decade. So you've got to have some management skills and some people skills, and he did.
And a personality to fill up a room.
Yeah, and he did. And he was a decent family man. He was an interesting guy. So that was like the biggest shock to me, I think. And I think you really need to appreciate that to understand how he maintained this business and this empire, and how he actually maintained a degree of popularity. I mean, prosecutors didn't go after him because they knew that juries would kind of like the guy. And that was always an interesting wrinkle in his career.
What was the other thing about him?
He kind of got screwed by the government. You know, he was guilty as all hell. He deserved to go to jail. But the tax case against him was a big mess, and they kind of railroaded him. I'm not asking for sympathy for him. I'm not expecting, because he deserved to go to jail. But it's really interesting to see just how the government wanted to make an example of him because they wanted to show that prohibition was going to be enforced, and they wanted to send a message that these crimes were serious. So they really bent a lot of the rules to put him away.
How'd you pick that book, Al Capone? Or him as a character, right?
You know, I was fascinated by Louis Armstrong. It actually came about that way. I was thinking about doing an Armstrong
So
book.
the first Ali comes from telling a person to do Babe Ruth,
right.
And this one is
From
Louis Armstrong. You go right to
you
Al
make
Capone.
these leaps, and that's how
These people get left on the side of the highway on the way to somebody else.
I could give you a list of like 100 books that I've left I've left on the side. You know, because you think about doing a book and then you realize there's a reason not to.
All right.
So I was interested in Louis Armstrong, and then I was looking at the connection between Armstrong and Capone. Did they ever meet? Did Armstrong ever perform in Capone's clubs? And looking for Armstrong in the Capone books, I found that the Capone books were just really a mess. That they were all full of these gangster cliches, and I didn't get a feel for what he was really
They're
like.
just kind of top of the tree line.
Yeah.
Not real depth. And
Yeah, they were cartoon characters. And then I came across the papers of the man who prosecuted Capone that nobody had ever seen before. Thousands and thousands of pages from Capone's trial, from the notes of the investigation, and wiretaps that were all sitting in a college professor's office in Nebraska. Original documents. I mean,
oh wow,
brittle
That's
yellow.
weird.
Now it's at the National Archives.
and just sitting there.
Yeah, this guy had hoped to write a book 20 years ago about the man who built the case against Capone and never did. So once I found those documents, that's when I knew I had something about Capone that would be really new and interesting.
Do you think Capone could have been Capone in any other city but Chicago? Or was Chicago the perfect city for Al Capone to be the character he was?
Yeah, I think it had to be Chicago. New York wouldn't have worked. And he's from New York. He's a Brooklyn guy. Like me, you know, we have a lot in common. He would have had a hard time in New York because there were much more powerful mafia families there. Chicago was wide open, but was also big enough and registered enough on the national media that he could become a celebrity. So I think, I don't think it would have worked anywhere but Chicago. And the police department was corrupt enough that he could really make his way. And that was important.
They could be the partners he needed.
Yeah, because the police department never really caught up to the growth of the city at that point. And it was really, police were still wildly underpaid. There was no chance that they were going to be able to enforce prohibition anyway, so they were happy to take his bribes. And, it was a perfect...
Did you ever go to the Green Mill to research that?
Oh, yeah, but...
that great story about that booth there.
Yeah, I'm not convinced it's true. I hate to say it. I love the Green Mill, and Dave Jamillo is a great guy. And I probably...
You don't like the sidewalk underneath?
Yeah, I've been under the tunnels under the Green Mill. But remember, all these buildings have tunnels to deliver the beer and deliver the coal, and doesn't mean Capone was using them.
Please don't dispel this great mythology. Okay, why do you think? I know we're here to talk about Ali, but Capone. Why do you think that America has a fascination with the criminal rebel that thumbs it at the establishment and can get away with it?
I think it's because we all dream about getting away with it. Some of us try. Most of us don't. So I think that's why everybody likes crime movies. That's like why we like car chases, because it's fun to imagine yourself behind the wheel and leaving the cops behind. And I think Capone is the ultimate example of that, because he flaunted his outlaw status. He said, of course I'm breaking the law. What are you going to do about it? And decided that he could be a celebrity gangster. And really, there's something fascinating about that.
Lou Gehrig, two things
about Lou Gehrig.
Yeah.
He was so painfully shy, like the most gorgeous, strongest man in Major League Baseball, playing for the Yankees, one of the greatest players of all time, and he wouldn't even go out at night with the other guys. He just wanted to go back to his hotel room and read a book. He was so scared of girls, so scared of the nightlife, just an incredibly shy guy. And then when he gets sick, this is my second thing about Lou Gehrig, when he gets sick, that's when he finally manages to come out of his shell and show the world that he's not afraid to share this illness with everybody. And that was really his greatest moment, I think.
And Jackie Robinson, two takeaways that you didn't know until you started the research or writing?
Yeah, his wife was kind of the hero of his story, and she never gets the credit. Rachel is this amazing woman. And that year, 1947, when he broke in, they didn't even have their own apartment. They were so sure that so unsure that this was going to work, that they rented a room from a complete stranger. Didn't even have their own bathroom, their own kitchen, and it was Rachel and Jack and the baby, like a 4-month-old baby, living in this rented room of a complete stranger. And I think that so often the women in these stories don't get the credit they deserve. Rachel Robinson,
she stiffened his spine for this process
all the way through his whole career. She was in some ways the not just brave but smart. And just a brilliant counselor to him, I think, who kept him from going crazy.
Did you ever see the Jackie Robinson piece at Looking Glass?
Yeah, I did. I thought it was terrific.
Yes, I agree with you. And the pill?
The pill came from a sermon my rabbi gave at Anshe Emet, where he said the birth control pill.
Let's just be clear, this is a conservative rabbi, not an Orthodox.
That's right.
For those of us that know the difference on that one, yeah.
Yes. He said he thought the birth control pill was perhaps the most important invention of the 20th century. And he was using it to say that we're all partners with God in the creation of the universe, and that we have to think about the fact that we can change the whole universe. And here's an invention that really did. And I thought about it for a while and maybe slept through part of the sermon too. But what I was left with was, if it's so important, how come we don't know who invented it or how it got invented? And why would anybody invent a birth control pill in the 50s, 60s, when men were in charge of everything? Why would they want to give women more power? And it was illegal at the time anyway. I knew that much. So how did it get done? And so I started looking into it and found that it was this.
Well, they kind of parallel parked. It wasn't the purpose of the pill wasn't at first about the pill. I mean, about controlling birth.
Well, the intention was to come up with a pill that controlled reproduction, but they marketed it as a pill simply to control women's cycles.
Right.
That was their way of slipping it past the FDA.
Do you give the rabbi any of the royalties from the book?
No,
or not?
no.
Does he know or she know?
Yes, he knows.
Okay. What is Ali's connection to Chicago? Why? What's the history here? Why Chicago?
Chicago's hugely important to Ali.
Yeah.
He comes here as an amateur boxer. He grows up in Louisville.
Right.
Comes here as an amateur to fight in the Golden Gloves, and this is where he first encounters Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. So he goes back to Louisville, and he's been awoken a little bit, and he wants to write a paper for his high school English class about the Nation of Islam, which the fact he was such a bad student, the fact that he wanted to write a paper of any kind should have been encouraged. But the teacher said, no, that's too
radical.
crazy, that's too radical. And that excited him even more, because now he knew it was dangerous. He liked making trouble. He liked challenging authority. So he became more interested in the Nation of Islam. And then once he met Malcolm X and decided he was going to join the Nation of Islam, he began coming here more often, and then moved here in the mid-'60s and married a girl from Chicago. Actually, his first wife was from Gary, Indiana, and living in Chicago. His second wife grew up in Chicago, and they made a home here. And he lived here for a good chunk of his boxing career.
And he has the home that used to be in Michigan and stuff like that.
Yeah, the home in Berrien Springs, Michigan is still. I think the family still owns that one.
Yes, they do. Where did he live in the city?
He lived in Hyde Park, on right across the street from Elijah Muhammad.
Now, give me your back. How did you? You're not from Chicago.
No, I grew up in New York.
Yeah.
And I've been here for 23 years now.
Do you describe yourself as a Chicagoan?
I would, and my kids certainly are Chicagoans. I know a lot of people feel like if you're not born here, you can never claim true Chicagoan status, I'm okay with it.
Well, we're going to test you at the end and see if you really are.
All right.
So in Chicago, you go to Northwestern?
Yep. Came here when I was right out of high school, and then moved away for a while. Moved to New Orleans and Dallas. Did some newspaper jobs. Then came back here in '95 because I was chasing a girl who decided to go to University of Chicago for grad school. So moved back here. Been here ever since.
How did that go? We're
turn? Married. We got 3 kids, so life is good.
So we have Northwestern and the U of C in our background.
And Chicago Public Schools for the kids.
Well, that's excellent. That's excellent. So on Ali, how do you research? How do you make a decision? Because there's no other biographies, but there's a ton of material. Or on Capone, how do you even begin to consume information and filter through everything that's going to be relevant for this?
That's the hardest part, but it's also the fun part, because in the beginning you feel like there's no way I can master this amount of material. I'm one guy. I don't have research assistants. I don't have like a big enough filing cabinet for all this stuff that I'm gathering.
Does your wife put you in the basement and all
laundry room?
Yeah.
I work out of the laundry room. I still do. So I'm on my 6th book, and I'm still working out of the laundry room. But we've upgraded the laundry room. We've actually carpeted it now. I'll do hundreds and hundreds of interviews. For Ali, it was something like 600 interviews. I'll read all the books. I'll gather old newspaper stories. I'll go to archives and copy stuff out of libraries. I'll submit FOIA requests to the FBI. And I'm just trying to build like the pieces of a life story. And it takes years for each one. And there comes a point somewhere after around a year or so that you feel like, okay, I'm starting to understand this. I think maybe I can write this story. Because the first year, you're just completely intimidated and feeling like there's just no way that one guy can write this life story, especially for somebody like Ali, who there's just led such a big life and there's so much material out there. For Gehrig, there wasn't that much. I had to, like, every little scrap I could find was exciting. But for Ali, you could just spend the next 6 months watching him on YouTube and never run out of stuff to watch. It's just overwhelming.
What about on Capone?
Capone, again, like, not that much. He didn't do a lot of interviews. He did some. He didn't write his story. I actually found a letter at the Newbery where he had signed a contract agreeing to write his life story. And the publisher turned it down because he wouldn't promise that he was going to get into all the dirty stuff. And Capone wanted to write a book that presented himself as a businessman. and the New York publishers weren't interested in it. And the Newbery had
the reinvention of Al Capone.
Yeah, he wanted to remarket himself. It was smart. But they wouldn't let him do it.
So let me ask you, you're now thinking of a book on Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
That is not a person that's got, I think that, Taylor Branch has a great series. How do you decide, you're saying Muhammad Ali, 35 years, no real complete from beginning to end biography. That is not true about Martin Luther King. And the Taylor Branch, I will just say, I think it's one of the great, how do you decide you're going to write something on somebody that has been covered?
It's tough.
Versus somebody that has not been really.
Yeah, there's a much higher bar. And Taylor Branch's books are great, but there's also 3 books and it's something like 2,500 pages. And I think that what's happened, and even that's 20 years ago now, a lot has happened in this country in terms of race in those 20 years. A lot of new material from the FBI has come out on Martin Luther King in those 20 years. And I think as a result of the holiday and the fact that King has become kind of like this monumental figure. We've forgotten what he's like as a person. And Taylor Branch's book is a story of the whole civil rights movement with King at the center. It's not a straight biography. A biography is much more intimate and really allows you to empathize with the figure. And that's the kind of book I wanted to write, something that would make King real and vibrant again, especially for younger people and people who haven't read the 2,500 pages of Taylor Branch. So I think the key is really that it's one volume. It's focused just on King. You don't need to hear about every single march. You need to get a feel for this man. And it's the right time to do it. You've still got a lot of people alive who knew him. I'm already interviewing
John Lewis,
Andrew Young, Harry Belafonte. These people, they're not all around anymore, but this is really the last shot at some of these guys.
It's interesting listening to you talk about, obviously, Muhammad Ali, Lou Gehrig, Capone. I know some things about Dr. King. Myself, I did actually read all 3 volumes, but that is the public persona and the private persona or character are not the same.
Really
in
different.
All 3.
Right.
I don't know enough about Jackie Robinson, but Ali had a image to the world And I'm not saying it was an image, but it was our takeaway. And you said he was humble and yet called himself the greatest, and then he was abusive of his wives. Capone was a criminal, but he fancied himself as a businessman and was very, not just gregarious, but a family man. That's not exactly the person you would expect. The criminal is not the family man. I mean, each of these people have, I wouldn't call it split personality, but they're public and they're private. And how do you strip that away when you're writing? I mean, how do you kind of deal with the dichotomy?
I think you don't, you embrace the complexity.
Not that it's true for everybody.
Yeah. I think you embrace the complexity and you ask the reader to trust you that in the end it will feel like a complete person, and it might feel like more of a real person. And that's really the goal, is to make these people feel like human beings. Because if you think that Martin Luther King is just this monumental figure, the guy carved out of stone, then you can't really be inspired by him. You can't think about what I can do. But if you see him as a human being with flaws and a sense of humor, and if you know his jokes, the good ones and the bad ones, and you can imagine how this real person did what he did. But if you start to just treat him like he's, you know, this mythological figure, you can't appreciate just how great those accomplishments are.
You always forget that, you know, I mean, I served in 2 White Houses, President Clinton's White House. I'm 31 as a staff person. This guy's dealing with Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy at 34 as almost as an equal.
That's
It's an incredible, and at a time in which that wouldn't be possible based on the fact of his race. That's an incredible, and not intimidated by it.
34 and black at a time when most of America is considered that to be inferior to begin with. And he's dead by 39. And his career is only 13 years long. And think about how much he accomplished there. And the last 3 or 4 years, most people consider him a failure for those years.
Yeah, he loses control. And
so, yeah, we forget all of that.
Well, we obviously know Dr. King has a long history in Chicago.
Yeah, it helps with these books if there's a Chicago connection, because I don't have to travel as much for the research. And I've done a lot of research at Chicago Public Libraries. I should say thank you for that.
So now let me ask you, give me 2 figures that you thought you were going to research a book on and you did not end up doing them.
Oh, man. That's a good one. One of them has a great Chicago connection, actually. The nation's first private eye, head of the Secret Service under Lincoln, Alan Pinkerton. I spent almost a year researching Alan Pinkerton and thinking about doing a book on him. And ultimately, he sold out all his principles. He was an abolitionist. He protected Lincoln. And then late in his career, he ended up like squashing slave rebellions in the Caribbean and just sold out everything he believed in for money, and then became this great union buster. And I just couldn't stand the thought of spending that much time with him.
Notoriety.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Oh, there have been so many. And sometimes I'll see them pop up as books. Other people will do them, you know, because when you go through that many ideas, you're gonna.
Did you ever think when you were studying journalism at Medill that you were going to do biographies?
No, not for a minute. I just wanted to be a newspaper reporter, and never thought that I would aspire to books. But after I'd written enough and I'd started doing magazine stories, I worked for Chicago Magazine and then the Wall Street Journal, I started getting ideas for books, and I thought, might as well try. And I was lucky that I started doing it at about the same time the newspaper business started shrinking and jobs were getting cut. So I'm kind of lucky that I abandoned that ship when I did.
It's bad.
Really bad.
Yes, and it's not good for the political system.
It's not good for the country. You know, we need
That's
newspapers.
what I was referring to.
Yeah, I would argue that certain recent catastrophes in electoral history would not have happened if newspapers had been stronger, and if people had.
You want
been
to
able
name any of them? You can't. It's not, we're not
the election of Donald Trump, I don't think would have happened if people had strong regional newspapers. I think people would have trusted their editorial boards at small papers in the Midwest and in the South, and people aren't reading those papers anymore. They're not getting a trusted voice of reason.
Yeah, well, the problem is they also don't trust media, which is why they're going around to find information.
That's true, but I think people used to trust their local papers in Birmingham, Alabama, and Oklahoma City.
I actually think, I mean, there's a longer discussion on a total separate subject, but I'll throw it out here, is if, and it was because I was just reading another history book, if there was a consensus of protection and respect for elected officials during the war, during the Depression, etc., and all the way through even the Cold War, because there was real life and death at stake. And then our image gets shattered in Vietnam and in Watergate. And even though there's life and death, you don't feel like you're on the cutting edge of a nuclear war.
Right.
I think that the people in journalism's view of people in public life has gotten too cynical, too, and there was, if the other one was, you were protective of elected officials and you basically ignored certain things for the larger interest. Today, I'm not talking about personal, I'm talking about just like you're guilty before you're proven innocent, and it's just way too dark, way too cynical, way too crass, where not everything is always that dark.
That's probably true, and I think
it's overshot the runway.
Yeah,
I don't think it's healthy for the body politic.
I think you're probably right, and I'm a product of that generation. I grew up reading about Watergate, and that's part of why I wanted to become a journalist, because I wanted to be this crusading, this fighter for justice, and it does lead to a degree of cynicism, and sometimes it goes too far. Maybe.
Yeah, my whole thing is you could be critical, you just can't be cynical, and I think right now people use cynicism as a replacement of criticism.
I agree with you.
Do you read any presidential biographies and ever think about elected officials?
I generally avoid the political stuff. I haven't read any of the big fat presidential biographies. I've read parts of the LBJ books, but I've never read them from start to finish.
Really?
No. I admire Robert Caro, but I've never read the books start to finish.
I love the Caro series on Lyndon Johnson.
I may have to, now that I'm doing MLK, I'm going to have to do a deep dive into it.
I think that also the recent one on Bobby Kennedy was really, really good.
Yeah.
I thought there was something in that book that I thought was really captured Jack and Bobby Kennedy. One is he said that Jack Kennedy was a pragmatist in a idealist wrapping, and Bobby Kennedy was an idealist in a pragmatist wrapping. And I thought that kind of captures the two of them.
Yeah,
perfect.
That sounds right. What about you? More pragmatist, more idealist?
Well, I have a saying. I say to my son, but I also say to my daughters when we talk about politics, not all the time, but is you have to be idealistic enough to know why you're doing what you're doing, and then ruthless enough to get it done. And I think sometimes, we idolize, I'm looking at my walls, we idolize Lincoln, we idolize Roosevelt, they were ruthless politicians. They had ideals, there's no doubt. I think, the truth is, if you're idealistic, but you're not tough enough, you're really never going to get anything done. If all you are is tough, you're going to get lost. Right. Without knowing how to get to where you got to go. And so I think that, you have to be both. And there's like I said to you, there's an outside persona and an inside. An effective chief executive or effective politician, public servant, is somebody that embodies both of them, because otherwise you couldn't really be effective.
Yeah.
And the people we know are the ones that make an impact.
That's right.
And you look at what Lincoln did to get the 13th Amendment. Today, you'd have an inspector general report about him. But he did it. He got it done.
Yeah.
In the same way that you can look at, there's things that Lyndon Johnson did to get the Civil Rights Bill done. And today, that would have an independent prosecutor looking at it.
Right, right.
And we will not talk about how we did certain legislation for either president. Because I've never hired a lawyer, and I don't plan on hiring one. So that is my view.
Yeah.
And I think that is a more, I wouldn't say, it is more realistic, but it also captures, it looks great when, I think there's a moment in time now, like that was, why did everybody kind of start to gravitate to plays about Lyndon Johnson? Because you had this impasse in Washington, and people wanted somebody that could do that. They just don't want to know the how unless you're looking at it in retrospect.
True, yeah. And even King got in a lot of heat for being pragmatic, for, he was seen as being too moderate for even dealing with the political world. But he was a guy who had no political power, who had no elected office, and he was able to do this work and get things done, build an entire movement. He had to be pragmatic at times.
Yeah, that's always the switch you're caught in.
Right.
And when you take your chips off the table and stuff like that. It's a hard process and that stuff.
Yeah.
So can I ask one other question? There's more on the mechanics. As you're finishing Ali and going through it, is that when you start to think about Martin Luther King?
Right. Well, as I'm going through the editing and starting to build up the marketing campaign and thinking about how I'm going to sell this thing, that's when I can start thinking about what I'm going to do next. And ideally, you come up with an idea before the last book comes out, because it takes a good 6 months to a year just to get a deal for it and to start getting people to talk to you. And with
you don't go to the same publisher all the time.
Not always. You give them first crack at it, and if they make you a good offer, and if you like your editor, you stick with them. If you don't, if you think you can get a better deal somewhere else, you jump.
Why did Ali become a world famous athlete?
Well, first of all, he won the heavyweight championship.
No,
that helps.
I understand that,
but beyond that, it was because he spoke out at a time when black athletes were expected to be polite and respectful and be good sportsmen and not use this for political purposes. He did everything that you weren't supposed to do. And just at the time when black power was starting to be spoken of and black pride, he was really at the cutting edge of that. And
Could he have been that same athlete in the 50s or the
No,
40s?
absolutely
So
not.
it had to be that window.
Yeah,
In American
the timing was
history.
perfect, and the Nation of Islam really gave him a philosophy, an operating principle to go with that he probably wouldn't have come up with on his own, because there was no way. He could have joined the civil rights movement, but he wasn't really cut out for that. He needed to be an outsider. He needed to be on the fringe, and Nation of Islam gave him that spot to operate from.
What do you consider his best fights?
Well, I think
The Frazier?
Frazier, even the Frazier 1, which he lost, I think is one of his greatest fights. Frazier 2 and 3 are just too brutal. I hate to see him getting beat up like that. I think the Foreman fight is probably his greatest victory. And
The George Foreman
yeah,
fight.
in Zaire. And he's diminished at this point. He's taking too many punches. He's not as quick as he used to be, but he still finds a way to win. And I think that's the real inspiring thing.
He was an artist that understood the science of the ring.
Yeah, if you watch, most people just say, look at that fight and say, well, he's just up against the ropes taking all these punches. But his defense is brilliant because he's taking these punches, but they're not really connecting, and he's moving in ways that you don't really notice, so that those punches don't hurt until Foreman gets tired and then he turns on him.
All right, we have it's a quick round on 5.
Do I lose my driver's license or something if I fail?
No, we just charge you some more fees or
All
something.
right, that's
Ready?
fair. Yeah.
Thick or thin pizza?
Thin pizza. I'm still
-1.
working that way. Yeah.
Okay.
I got to admit, I got to be honest.
Cubs or Sox, and we'll see if you answered this.
I have
or-
season tickets for the Cubs.
Okay.
Had them for
You don't root.
20
How did you
years.
root in the last 3 games? Who did you root for?
Cubs Mets.
Yeah.
Oh, Cubs.
Okay. That proves okay. That's one
Oh,
thing.
I'm a Yankee fan. That's why.
Hancock or Sears? Yankee fan, you just gave it away, so you're -2 already. All right. Sears or Hancock?
I'm a North Side guy, so I go Hancock.
Okay. River or lake?
Lake.
Okay.
I jog on the lake every day.
Okay. You'll probably like the new division between the lake and the
I'm looking
running
forward
track.
to it.
Yeah.
Right now it's very muddy, though.
Yeah, well, you'll
I'm
be
excited about it.
Okay. You run in the winter?
Yeah.
Well, then it'll be done for you in time just for this
Good.
the winter run. 16-inch or 12-inch softball?
I've tried 16-inch. It's dangerous. It's
Okay.
break some fingers.
You're -3. I think,
I'm being honest.
don't worry. There's no penalty. But I think
We'll see about that.
yeah. The Yankee thing was the giveaway. Okay.
Yeah.
We got to work on that answer
I
one
know,
more
I
time.
know.
It's okay. It's okay. Do you ever like going back to the magazine format for topics or stuff like that, or no?
No, I mean I love writing magazine stories, but right now the business is so screwed up that there's no reason to. It takes a lot of time and energy to write these books and to keep an eye on my kids and pay a little attention to my wife. Writing a magazine story.
Guys, edit that out. So in case she decides to listen,
Paying a lot of attention to my wife.
Yeah. Why don't we work on that again?
Yes,
Okay.
I like to pay as much attention as possible to my wife, and there's no time to take on magazine
I
stories
would
which
bring
don't
home some
pay anyway.
pizza if I were you.
Deep dish.
Deep dish. Absolutely. John Ike, it's a pleasure to have you.
Nice talking to you. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, thanks. This is a great book.
Yeah, this is fun. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, John.
You've been listening to Chicago Stories with Mayor Emanuel. You can subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tweet your guest ideas using #ShyStories. Thanks for listening.